We're hearing reaction on a new bill in Raleigh that would limit the rights of transgender people in North Carolina.
That bill, called the Women's Safety and Protection Act, was introduced by a group of Republican state senators late last month. WUCT's Ava Bringord looking into the bill today. Ava, no surprises here. This is organizations across the state very divided.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Fran. The language of the bill says this is about protecting women and girls against sexual violence in places like bathrooms and dorm rooms. But those critical of the bill call it dangerous and discriminatory. A Senate bill aimed at restricting the rights of transgender people in the state has once again left lawmakers divided. Senate Bill 516, called the Women's Safety and Protection Act, strictly defines gender based on a person's reproductive organs at birth, without regard for their chosen gender. It also bars people from changing their gender on birth certificates, driver's licenses, and bans transgender people from using restrooms at public schools that don't correspond to their biological sex. Conservative groups like NC Values says this is about protecting women and girls against sexual violence from biological men in spaces designated for women.
We want to make places like bathrooms, locker rooms, overnight sleeping facilities safe for girls.
While groups like the LGBTQ Center of the Cape Fear Coast says bills like this do more harm than good. They sent a statement saying, quote, "The bill, which claims to be in defense of women's safety, will end up harming and endangering both the women it claims to protect and the transgender community at large." If this sounds familiar, that's because it is. Almost a decade ago, a similar law, dubbed the bathroom bill, was far more sweeping and ultimately cost the state millions in business investment, including damaging Wilmington's film industry. Democrats like Senator Julie Mayfield say they can't believe a similar bill is advancing at the state level once again.
I'm sorry, but this is just mean. There is like no other way to talk about it. It is just mean, and it is bullying, and we need to be done with it.
Republican lawmakers have already put restrictions on transgender women and girls playing female sports. And given the GOP majority in Raleigh, this bill is likely to advance despite the opposition. I asked both the primary sponsors for this bill to speak with us on camera today. We did hear from Senator Vicky Sawyer, but she declined, while Senator Brad Overcash did not respond. Fran?
Ava, this bill advanced to the Senate Rules Committee last week. Do we have any update on its progress?
So we don't, Fran. However, if the bill turns into law, it will go into effect on October 1st.
All right, Ava, thanks so much.